Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
Goodbye doom and gloom, and hello Germany. Welcome to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Stephen Carroll.
And I'm James Woolcock.
So, Keir Starmer has traded the Rose Garden in Downing Street for the Chancellery in Berlin, where he's meeting Olaf Scholz. Part of his effort to improve Britain's relationship with its European neighbours. That, of course, began at the European Political Community meeting, which Starmer hosted in Blenheim Palace just days after the election. Now he's aiming to not sign a new treaty with Germany, covering cooperation on defence, technology and the environment. One Starmer advisor described Scholz as the leader the UK Prime Minister is closest to, both personally and politically.
Look, Stephen, I spent years watching Brexit debates in Parliament. I know this is an area that Keir Starmer is very, very aware of from his 3 years as Jeremy Corbyn's shadow Brexit secretary. So it's not a shock that he has some very clear ideas of what he thinks he can do better than the previous government. But, and it's a big but, he's also very acutely aware of the pitfalls of being seen to be too close to Europe in the UK. I mean, it was Starmer who pushed for Labour back in 2019 to have a stance in favour of a second referendum. That was a stance that voters hated and was very hard to defend back in the sort of 2019 election. So he knows that if he's seen to be too pro-reversing Brexit, which is how right-wing press and right-wing media will seize on it, that'll be seen to roll back Brexit, and you are certain that Nigel Farage and Reform voters will sort of look upon that very unfavourably. So you can see that kind of concern, that awareness in how the government has rejected a proposed post-Brexit youth mobility scheme after it was reported that Spain's Prime Minister floated that idea with Starmer during a meeting. I think the proof will be in the pudding of what actually gets announced. Will Starmer's answer, any kind of proposed deal with either Germany or Europe, actually boost economic growth for Britain, one of his key aims, without triggering some kind of right-wing or reform voter backlash to being seen to be kind of cozying up to the EU?
OK, so that's perhaps the backdrop to this in Britain. It'd be interesting to see how much public opinion is involved since those moments as well, though. But let's talk about what this visit to Germany could yield for Keir Starmer. Our Germany correspondent, Oliver Crook, is by chance in London with us today. Lucky us. Hi, Ollie. Great to see you. Hey. Where do the UK and Germany, I suppose, have common ground that they could build on with this visit?
Yeah, well, listen, Stephen, you're probably the only person who goes to Germany to avoid doom and gloom, because it's a tough situation there economically, and I think that they have a lot of the same issues, both Keir Starmer and Olaf Scholz. So listen, they have politically, they're very closely aligned in terms of the sort of European complex. Keir Starmer and Olaf Scholz are very close in terms of what their political positions are in Europe. We know that Keir Starmer, as we've been hearing from the very beginning, from Blenheim Palace and beyond, wanting to reset relations with Europe. I think that the issue is there's a very limited degree that Olaf Scholz can offer other than sort of positive support and sort of grins that you see them, very happily, meeting and talking to each other, because of course Germany is still part of the EU. And as you mentioned, and I think this is really an interesting point, because, when I lived in London, we spent so much time covering Brexit. Have public attitudes in the UK really changed that much in terms of proximity economically with the EU? And for both of these leaders that are really both dealing with some political issues and fighting off kind of extremes domestically, one of the things traditionally that you could from mainstream politics hand to the population is sort of economic growth through these arrangements. If you don't have that lever to pull, as the UK doesn't right now, what can you really offer from that relationship? Of course, defense is front and center post-Ukraine. That is sort of a winning issue. But again, something concrete coming from that is at very least months away.
Well, there seems to be quite a lot of parallels there, Ollie. Both centre-left leaders, both want kind of growth, both see Ukraine as a key issue. Does Scholz's political journey hold a cautionary tale for Starmer?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think so. One of the things that, for example, that both are dealing with, again, are sort of the extremes of politics within Germany and within the UK. We have state elections in Germany. And if you learn something from Scholz, it's, well, maybe don't go into a coalition with other governments that have a hugely different political views, because Scholz is going to get absolutely crushed in the state elections that are coming over the next few weeks. Single digits, right? Coming from being the chancellor of the country. It's really very brutal for him. And again, he's a sort of weakened domestic leader. They're both dealing with an issue that they, I think, find very uncomfortable politically with their population, which is the question of immigration. It is a major question in Germany. It is one of the probably biggest issues that's going to come up for these state elections that are being held this Sunday and the one after. So I think that navigating those is very difficult. But again, I think that what advantage that Starmer has is, A, it doesn't have to deal with that coalition. And though is a tight budget, and Starmer has cautioned about that, he does not have this debt break, which parts of the German government have likened to boxing with their hands tied behind their back, because they just don't have the fiscal room to make some of the adaptations that the economy needs.
Oliver Crook, thanks for dropping in on your flying visit to brief us on the German side of this story.
Well, Stephen, there's more to Europe than just Germany. I feel like it's no one to tell you other than me, but Keir Starmer has made no secret of his ambitions to transform the global perception of the UK. Let's talk to Evie Aspinall. Now, she is the director of the British Foreign Policy Group. Why has Keir Starmer picked Germany as the place to start building better relations with the EU?
I think first and foremost, it comes from Germany's kind of predominance in the EU, and that's fluctuated a bit, particularly following the kind of most recent EU parliamentary elections. But von der Leyen is still president of the EU Commission, and she is German. So there's still a lot of influence there coming from Germany. And we also see that actually on the world stage, Germany has been stepping up. It's been a slow process. Where in the past they hadn't thought much about defence in any sense, particularly post-World War II. There have been lots of kind of concern about that. Germany is, following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, really focused on leading a bit more on the world stage. And actually the UK is kind of seeing that as an opportunity for the UK to kind of have that fellow leader within Europe. So I think it's partly about Germany's influence, and also the fact that, as we've said before, that the two leaders are quite well aligned. It's a natural alliance compared to some of the other parts of Europe. It's much more comfortable for Starmer, so it feels like a logical place to start.
Is this a good strategy for Britain to try and build on defence cooperation as a way of opening up the broader improved relations with its European neighbours? Is this a strategy that you feel could gain significant traction?
I think it's definitely the best strategy that the UK has. And actually, when we talk to European counterparts, it's defence that they're most willing to cooperate with the UK on. It makes the most sense. And particularly as we look to a potential Trump presidency in the United States, I think there's a growing recognition that Europe needs to work together, including with the UK, on defence. There are still some limitations, and ultimately Starmer doesn't have the scope to really move that close to the EU in terms of, rejoining or kind of free movement, etc. There isn't the public support for that. So there are limitations. So defence can open the door, but the question is, how much further can we go within the realm of public opinion?
I appreciate, Evie, that you there said sort of defence was the best strategy, but the thing I want to sort of push back a tiny bit on is why Germany versus the EU? Because we look back at these echoes of Brexit. Boris Johnson, David Davis, David Frost, they all swore they could break the EU into sort of bilateral players. Yet the first thing out of our correspondent Oliver's mouth was Germany is limited to what it can do because it's part of the EU. So how much faith should we have in this promise from the UK government of a deal with Germany in the next year?
So I think the benefit of this is partly in the UK as much as anything, in the normalising of us engaging with Europe. And still to this day, there is a lot more public support now for UK engagement with the EU. And actually, a lot of Britons now support that. But there's still some tenseness. Whereas when it comes to Germany, that's seen as kind of relatively uncontroversial. And I think from a UK perspective, the more we can engage with individual countries, the more normalised that becomes, and the easier it becomes for Starmer to then engage with the EU as a whole. The other challenge is the EU itself at the moment is very difficult to engage with, particularly post its kind of recent elections. It's a bit of a mess. There's a lot of power dynamics going on, and it's really, really hard to navigate, especially when at the moment there's a Hungarian presidency, and the Hungarians and Starmer's views of the world are very different at the moment. So the EU is quite a difficult beast to tackle. And I think for Starmer, this is kind of the first step in the water that will hopefully help kind of along the way. But as you say, it's not foolproof.
Apart from defence, what are the other sort of key areas where the UK might be able to make progress in improving relations?
I think the primary ones are probably the economy and climate. So economically, we can move, and Starmer has said he will move closer towards alignment with the EU on various standards and regulations, and that will help with engagement with EU, but also with Germany. And there are specific bits of trade that the UK wants to move closer to Germany on. So I think the economy is a good one, and particularly as both nations' economies are struggling at the moment, there's a lot more appetite for that. And then climate change is the other one that, Labour really wants to be a key part of the UK's foreign policy, and it sees it as an opportunity for the UK to kind of improve its global reputation and also sees the economic benefits of tackling climate change. So we'll be keen to see Germany as a key partner in that as well.
Looking around the world, Evie, we have the US, where we have an election where two very different outcomes. We have China, where the UK's relationship with China is increasingly testy. And then obviously we've had the EU, where we've spent most of this conversation. Does the UK have other options outside of the EU? Where does it stand in the world now, sort of as we are, 8 years on after Brexit?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one. And I think kind of post-Brexit, the UK went through that cycle of trying to find who else it could partner with in the world. And it found it very difficult, actually. The United States has long been one of the UK's closest allies, but actually looking forwards, potential Trump presidency, even if Trump doesn't get elected, we're looking at a more isolationist United States. And perhaps we don't want to be quite so aligned with the US moving forward as kind of our top partner. So that's not the full answer. And then if we looked a lot at the Indo-Pacific in recent years, and the aim there was really to counter the growing influence of China. The challenge is that's the other side of the world. Increasing trade there is quite difficult, not least because it's the other side of the world. And also, the British public is much more nervous about those engagements with nations that they haven't heard as much about. When you talk to the British public about engagements with India, for example, which is a really important growing economy, the British public are very, very nervous. And actually, in conversations with places like India, they want to talk about migration, which is something that the UK really doesn't want to talk about. So the world is a big place. There's lots of people you could have relations with. But it does feel like, and particularly I think since the invasion of Ukraine, there's a renewed focus and recognition that actually Europe will always be, as our closest neighbour, our closest partner. And the more we can make of that, the better.
Evie Aspinall, Director of the British Foreign Policy Group, thank you very much for joining us. It's really interesting stuff, Stephen, and it's also fascinating. There are so many different areas of the world we are focused on. We haven't even brought up the Middle East and how that also could push up, say, inflation if it were to escalate.
Yeah, indeed. And, these are topics that the UK wants to have partners in the world to discuss them with as well. That's it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe. Give us 5 stars so other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by Tiwa Adebayo and our audio engineer was Sean Grastamakia. I'm James Woolcock.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. We'll be back with more tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.